I'm already here. All right. We're just looking at that 3 degrees. No, no, listen.
Kıymetli misafirlerimiz, saygıdeğer hocalarımız ve bizleri çevrimiçi platformlardan takip eden değerli dinleyicilerimiz. Dördüncüsü gerçekleşen fikri mülkiyet hukukunda güncel gelişmeler Uluslararası Sempozyumun ikinci gününe hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Our valuable guests, esteemed professor and valued elders who are following us from online platforms. I'd like to welcome to all the second day of fourth International Symposium on Current Developments in Intellectual Property Law. Sempozyumumuzun davetli konuşması Sayın Profesör Doktor Ayran Ekalboğlu'yu sunumunu gerçekleştirmek üzere kürsüye davet ettik. Kendisi fikirden pazarı gibi geleneksel varsayımın ötesinde döngüsel ekonomide fikri mülkiyet haklarının rolü isimli açılış konuşmasını yapacaktır. Professor Dr. Irene Kalboli, she will deliver the opening address entitled Beyond the Traditional Assumption of From Idea to Market, the Role of Intellectual Property Rights in the Social Economy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the symposium. As mentioned, my talk, as you can see, will focus on another important development of intellectual property and the economy today, which is the circular economy. When we look at what the most important current developments in the intellectual property fields might be at a global level, there are certainly two strands. One is the technology driven, meaning artificial intelligence, other technology like blockchain, digital goods, data, and then somewhat overlapping, but somewhat differently as well, there is the question of circularity, an economy. We live in a world in which we have to intervene in trying to prevent waste, recycle materials as much as possible, because the impact of development on humans, on climate, on pollution, and everything we do, it's staggering and it's getting worse. So this is something that our generation and even more your generation, particularly those of you who are young, cannot take for granted and has to intervene. So the idea is the intellectual property we're going to see in a minute serves to incentivize innovation. And innovation is essential for economic development. But today's innovation cannot continue to be a mass production of polluting things, has to be an innovation that it's also sustainable. We no longer talk just about development, we talk about sustainable development. The word sustainability obviously has multiple meanings. It's complicated to define, and you should not define in just one way. But what is certain is that our development has to be sustainable, prevent excessive waste, and be good for the environment and for people. It doesn't go. The slides don't move. Sorry about that. Okay. So I have published a book that has a lot of this discussion with my colleague Eleonora Rosati, and we also have a podcast in the WIPO Knowledge Center for anybody interested. I have written extensively about circularity, particularly fashion industry, because the fashion industry, as you might know, it's the second biggest polluter after the oil and gas industry. So every time you buy something, remember, are you buy something sustainable? Are you buy something that perhaps is made with some recycled materials? And so this is a line of research that I think is very important, and there's been quite a bit of decisions by the courts in multiple countries related to it. So we said intellectual property, it's really important for innovation. The justification, as many of you students know, for intellectual property is a right to exclude others, meaning it's a monopoly, gives somebody a right to do something on an exclusive basis while others cannot. So it's a cost for our society. But that cost is balanced by the gains that our society has. And the assumption has always been without right to exclude, innovators will not invest in innovation. And so we will not have a thriving economy, but rather an economy that produces cheaper and cheaper products. As mentioned though today, this relationship between intellectual property as a leverage, as an incentive to innovation, has to really include this element of sustainability in innovation, but sustainable innovation. And here's when somewhat, and this is really what brings the title of this keynote, is we have thought, and when we think about intellectual property, when we think about management of intellectual property, we tend to think from idea to market, meaning that from idea to the release of the products in the marketplace, assuming that then these products are sold, the reward for the inventors, the IP owners is made, and then products will be consumed, but the economic cycle, at least in the IP system, doesn't think about the post-sale life of the product, meaning that we don't think about from idea to market back to raw material to promote new products. We just think from idea to market because that's what the innovation, intellectual property incentive, traditional line of thinking has been. While the circular economy, that it's so important for economists, for scholars of management, for engineers. If you Google intellectual property and circular economy, you can find a variety of sources, many books, mostly by engineers, business organization scholars, food and sustainability scholar, but very little still by lawyers. And so the question is, does intellectual property function, and how it functions for this green? And again, the word green, can be very controversial because it's very common also to have this idea of greenwashing, say I'm green while I'm really not. So the question is, does IP help sustainability, circularity, or it can become a barrier to it? And this is where we are seeing a lot of the development in terms of court decision. In the fashion world, primarily in the trademark world, this is where we are seeing many of these cases. So in my research, I have divided the circular economy practices in 4 categories. The circular economy is really, I take the raw materials I produce, I market, and then we need to either repair, resell, and eventually, use those pieces of a product as new parts of a new product, either by collapsing the materials or just reusing parts of it. And this has a lot of jobs in the process. Think about car repairers, watch repairers, people who collect plastic and then they crash it and they make new fibers, for example, for 3D printings, and and so on. So when we think about circularity, the first thing we need to think about is reusing. Okay, I don't know if that's common for you to go and buy used clothes or a used car or a used toys. That's very common now in, in Italy, in the US, in the UK. Thrifting, it's very, vintage. It's very trendy. It's actually very fashionable to have used stores of nice things that didn't go, are not ruined and they can get a second life. My bag that I have there in my, my car now, it's second life. My watch is second life. Many things I buy today are second lives. All the crib, the strollers, the toys for my children, they were used goods, and so on and so forth. They're cheaper, they're still very good, and you actually do something good for the environment. The second practice is repairing. It might seem obvious. I have a car, it breaks, the warranty expired, and I want to repair it. Well, if I go to Audi, who sold it to me, that repair, that spare parts costs, maybe, 4,000 lira. If I go, 10,000 lira, if I go to a small garage, to Mr. Um, you know, Mr. Yusuf, then that part costs 2,000 lira. Obviously, there is a big difference in price or even inconvenience. Mr. Yusuf doesn't fix. I can get my car back in 2 days. While if I bring it to Audi, they keep it for 2 weeks because they get to get the actual parts from Germany and so on and so forth. So reusing same product, ability to repair actual products. So for me to get service and for people to providing a service to repair. Then we have upcycling, where we take, let's say, a Louis Vuitton bag that it's old and we cut the, the leather and we make it, a small pouch, or we made another product. Or I take, an old watch and I add pieces from another jewel and I accessorize it. I take Nike shoes and I change the strings or I paint them and I customize it. It's a way to rejuvenate the product so then people like to buy that products or something that we have in our drawers that we never use now gets again a second life. And finally, recycling, meaning taking, the plastic, crush it, make the fiber to create another products, or to take car and dismantle the various pieces, crush some, reuse some others in multiple ways. So all these practices are necessary to actually make the circle, this is why circularity, working. And so obviously IP can promote, patents promote technology that can be helping, recycling, and creating sustainable practices. Designing of products can be done so then it's easier to repair and to recycle. We can have a lot of good uses of IP as an incentive for sustainable practices. Again, this is an example of places where you can buy used things. If you are into luxury goods, Vestia Collectif, for example, is an excellent online certified place where you can actually get luxury goods at a fraction of the price of new, and so on. This is repairing. I repair my car, I go to repair my watch, I go to repair my iPhone, fell down, the screen broke. I can have, a new screen. There is a lot of agriculture machineries in Turkey. A tractor breaks, and I can just bring it to the garage in Balıkesir and then repair it. Upcycling is, getting buttons of things from old fashion or famous, often famous, but not necessarily famous items and do something else with them. And finally, I recycle, I take, plastic bottles and they become, your next shoes that are going to be 3D printed. So again, the question is, are these practices lawful under an IP effective or are they infringement? Because certainly, if the IP owner, the trademark owner, the patent owner, the copyright owner, the design owner does them, they are lawful. I'm Louis Vuitton. I get my old, bag and I prepare something new. No problem. But what if you are, Mr. Mustafa that now wants to have another activity in addition to be the dean and opens up a shop because he really likes old models and old toys and cycle them, personalize them and then sell them. Is that lawful? Are we interfering with the life of IP after sale, from idea to market and what next? Because the idea is we always thought, and the IT system is wired like that, there is value in the innovation. There is value in creating the innovation and in selling the innovation. But now we are realizing that there is a lot of value post sale. There is a lot of residual goodwill, as we say it, in technical terms, particularly for products that can be collectible, they can be of great quality, they are no longer sold. And think about the first Birkin by Hermes. The bag sold for millions of dollars, and Hermes got nothing. Mm? So the residual values, particularly in the luxury or collectible or cars, the good products, there is a lot of it. And the IP system never really thought of it. And the third party, so whoever gets in the line after sale, say, well, this is my value now because I own the property of that item. And the IP owners are waking up and say, oh, wait a minute, there is a lot of value there. This idea, for those of you who might be expert in copyright, has been in copyright for a while in the institution of resale rights. I buy a painting today by an unknown artist and I resell it in 10, 20, 20, 40 years for millions because that young artist became famous. Under many national laws, there is a right for the owner of the copyright to get back a percentage of that extra money in the second sales. Because the idea was often art increases value with time. While commercial goods, the idea is they decrease value with time. But now we are facing a world in which a lot of commercial goods also increase value with time. And so the law is struggling to figure out what to do. Who has the ownership? There is issues of ownership, issues of competition, issues of freedom of your artistic freedom, business, conducting business freedom, and so on. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with a concept called intellectual property exhaustion. With our colleague from Tashkent State University, we were talking about that last night. The idea in IP is I own the right on this remote. There is patents here, there's multiple patents, there is probably copyright in the software. But once somebody buys it, this very one copy, the rights are exhausted, meaning that I cannot copy the software, I cannot copy the patents, but I can resell and distribute the one item I have. It's IP property versus my physical property of that product. This is why we can buy used car, we can buy and gift things and so on. So the idea is IP should not go in the middle of further distribution because that will create an anti-competitive economy. However, there is exception to these principles. The so-called legitimate reason under which products are not exhausted. IP rights are not exhausted, primarily from a trademark standpoint, but also from a copyright standpoint. And, patent, it's a bit easier, it's less part of this discussion, but certainly design is as well. And probably the most important one is if a product has been changed, the quality has been altered through a repair, through an upcycling, then IP owner, trademark owner, can oppose the further circulation of that product because that product in its altered form could create confusion in the marketplace as to the source origin of the product. People might think so Louis Vuitton is the one who has created the new little product when I am not. So obviously, in today's economy, for example, in Europe, I'm not familiar with the Turkish system. There are many ways. We talked about licensing a couple of days ago to block the further distribution to contractor provision. In Europe, we have the selective distribution system, particularly for famous trademarks. And often, if you are a small retailer, you just don't want to be sued, even if you are right, because it costs more to go to court than just give up or getting, or get a license from the IP owner. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of cases that have been litigated and settled primarily. This is a case that was discussed in the Southern District of New York a few years ago, and was about a third-party seller called Shiver and Duke. And what they were doing, they were getting old Chanel and other famous designer button. The designer have the buttons in the clothes with the logos. And when the clothes are bad or they just are ruined, those buttons, they were taken out, and the designer were making with those buttons some jewelry. So the box is authentic, but then the jewelry is made not by Chanel, but by a third party. And obviously Chanel makes jewelry too. And so the question is that a problem? Well, it becomes a competitor with Chanel. The price was considerably different. A necklace by Chanel cost easily €1,000. Those were selling for €150 or $150. And so Chanel sued them, saying, well, I do jewelry as well. You are confusingly similar. Even though the people buy from you buying original, other people, you have changed. So these are materially different. The button was for a clothes, now is becoming a piece of jewelry. And perhaps the quality of your jewelry is not very good. And another problem was they never put a disclaimer. Something like this jewelry is made by Shiver and Duke, not by Chanel. Something that could dispel confusion. This case was settled, so we don't know. The party agreed to a settlement. This was another case where Louis Vuitton got over almost $500,000 in damages. This designer was taking genuine Louis Vuitton bags and was cutting them and making small accessories. And Louis Vuitton says, you cannot do that because that's my trademark. I also make this type of products, and you're infringing on my rights. It's trademark infringement and trademark dilution. And this again settled, but as part of the agreement, there was also, and that's published, a fairly high compensation of $600,000 in damages. This issue is so controversial and so important that I don't know if you're familiar with the APPI. APPI is the International Association for the Protection of Intellectual Property, which is housed in Switzerland. And at the latest International Congress in Yokohama in Japan this past October, in 2025, the next conference will be in Hamburg, also in October 2026. They issued 3 recommendations, and one was about trademarks. And that recommendation about trademarks it's all about exhaustion and sustainability. And from the beginning to recommendation to the end, they managed to say something and all the opposite. Okay, like usually we do in law. But what's quite interesting, it's a provision, I'm reading it for you, that says, number 8, sustainability consideration should not, in principle, override trademark rights. It also says on point 10, however, under certain exceptional circumstances, alteration, including practices such as recycling or upcycling, may be allowed when carried out for sustainability reasons, provided that certain conditions are met. And one of those conditions is the alteration does not involve any exploitation of or harm to the trademark image or reputation. And that's obviously is in the eyes of the beholder, because for a brand, it will always be a harm. And for a second party, cycle will never be. And so it will be up to the court to see whether there is a harm or not. And because it's so unpredictable, most likely this will bring to a settlement. So after this decision, I'm just going to mention very quickly a couple of decisions, that this year, at the end of 2025 in Singapore, there was this fellow who was taking also, you can see it's most of these cases are about famous trademarks. Famous trademarks that have all these logos that have a lot of resale value and continue to capture goodwill because they signal something. Often they signal status, and everybody wants status, and even better for cheaper. And this is not a fake, it's a real. So it's a real cheaper, which is the best of both worlds. And this fellow was taking Louis Vuitton and making other accessories. He was also making things with fake product. And so the court said there was an improper exploitation of the goodwill, and that was infringement. And very similarly, a court in China in the summer of 2025 said the same. Now, if you look at what these upcyclers were doing, they really were taking big bags and making smaller bags, but it's highly confusing, possibly. Mm. So they were really trying to completely free ride on the goodwill and remaking same things. It's debatable. Should I be able to do that? These are real bag and I remake them. But I don't remake them in something really artistic. I remake them in something that is very confusingly similar, so for people to get cheaper products. So the question then became, is upcycling always an infringement? And, somewhat the answer comes from Switzerland and latest from Korea. In Switzerland, there was this fellow, this small company called Artisan de Genève that have a very high savoir-faire know-how of making watches, watchmakings. And so their business was about buying used, very expensive watch and customize them and sell. One of the main trademark they were buying was Rolex watches. And Rolex said, well, you are customizing my watch, you are changing the quality. This is an infringement. And so what they did, they start to disclaim we're not affiliated, and they say, okay, we no longer provide a sale, meaning we are not buying ourselves used watches. We are just providing an upcycling service, meaning that you have a watch, you want as a customer to have personalize it. This is my property, my watch. I want to get a service, and this is not for commercial use for me because it's my own copy. And so the court said that personalization and customization as a service was allowed. Then the next question was if a company can advertise its service by using the name of famous products. Can I say, I customize Rolex watches, Patek Philippe watches, and so on, because I'm using the famous mark to advertise my services? And the very recently, the court in Switzerland said, yes, you can do that because that is referential use. And recently, the Korean Supreme Court said the same. This, you have a business that was upcycling products really by getting people with their old bags and then they were doing smaller or new bags, often following the actual new models of Louis Vuitton and so on. And so both the first instance and the appeal court said that it was infringement, but the Supreme Court just in at the end of February this year said, no, it's not, if it is just a customization service. So I just also an editorial on that. It's short, it's free, it's open access. And the question is, I'm calling it upcycling limiting blues, meaning that courts are trying to figure out, because they see there is value. We said from idea to market, and that's it. And now we are waking up. From market to death of the products, there is a lot of value. And the question is, who needs to capture that? Who needs to get the reward for this extra value? And so courts are saying, well, if you are an independent service provider that provides services for people for their own products on a customization basis, you should be able to do that. But if you are a big operation that buys a lot of used goods and then change them and you become a big competitors in the economy structure we have, that's no longer okay. So they're trying to figure out how to divide this practice between small customization, personal use, okay, bigger, mass sales, much larger scale, no good. Which from a theoretical IP standpoint doesn't make much sense because the principle is the same. If I customize a products and I customize 200 products in a week, there is 200 customized products out there. What if I just buy 200 products and then I sell them? Or I advise upcycler to do that. You set up a used goods shop because you can get old things and resell them identical. That's okay. And then, obviously, at the national level, we are not entering into cross-border, international or national exhaustion here. So I buy my used bag from you, and then I go to your cousin next door who does the upcycling service. So now it's just you have to set up a two-stop shop to be lawful. Remember, when there is a law, then there is always a way to work around it. You just need to do it legally and smartly. And so the courts might find if there is a connection between these two businesses, it's still commercial use. So again, takeaways. This is a very interesting area and one that will continue to bring work and bring discussion and bring disputes. Perhaps disclaimer, in some country, in the US, there was a case about Rolex. If they were printing on the watch, this is not, this is being customized by, for, that was okay. And obviously, these cases are mostly about famous product. And so the question is, who should capture the post-sale value? And so this is really open, but we have in Switzerland, there is a lady that was the head of the horlogerie union, sort of in Geneva. Her name is Fabienne Lupeau. And she has created this reluxury event in Paris every 2 years. It's going to take place this year as well. And here you really have all the big brands participating because they understand that today's economy and the people want vintage. Young people want the next great luxury is to buy, use, and cool, to make sure what we buy is sustainable. So there is a lot of value here, and the brands wants to be part of it. And so this is not a movement that will go away. It will continue to be. And the question is finding whether you could be just by owners or also by third parties. If the third party does 1-2 pieces very expensive, there is no problem. The problem comes when the third party does a lot of pieces, so then it becomes a threat for the reputation and obviously competition. And so the real question is whether this circularity will be control or not control. And control means that works less efficiently. But when it's not controlled, can become a wild market. So where is the balance? I think it's the key. And so, again, the question is we thought IP in that way, and we need to think IP as lawyers more and more in this way. And here I thank you. I don't know if there is any questions. Please.
I thank you, Professor, for your comprehensive presentation. My name is Barış Gözümlük. I'm an assistant professor of IP. I'd like to ask you a question about the conflict between upcycling and trademark owners. Why? Because the examples are mostly about famous trademarks. What's your opinion about non-famous trademarks? Because it's easier to decide when it comes to famous trademarks. Thank you.
Well, I think as always, we can see disputes when there is a lot of values. We have so famous mark can be high luxury and also non-high luxury. We have a lot of customization of Nike shoes, for example, Adidas shoes, also famous mark on much lower price point, much bigger mark, mass product. The question is, if I am a not very famous mark, the value of my second hand and the value for me perhaps is actually a good thing for me because if it's a completely different market, I might be see that as an advertisement. Even when I'm a famous mark, in the Philippines, there is a tradition to take old cans of Coca-Cola or other beverages and with the aluminum, cut the aluminum and make little tuk-tuk or other souvenirs to be sold or Christmas ornaments. And you can really, and they are sold in the street, in shops, is very common. And Coca-Cola is actually, this is almost second advertisement because they will not do anything with their empty cans. The products is not the can, the products is the Coke inside the can. And to have people reusing their brands in that way might become something that is actually interesting. The question is, where is the limit? Because what if I take that and I do some, obscene little statues, or I do something which might be offensive for a certain population? Well, that might become tarnishment. And so I think it's case by case discussion. In some case, might be free advertisement. In other cases, might be there is really no harm because I have some Christmas ornament bought that have packaging of some unknown mark simply because they were reusing them as materials. Or you have Michelin tires that become, some things to insulate. That's also, you don't really have a problem with that. So I think it really very much depend on case by case. We see a lot of litigation in the famous mark area because there is where most value is. And I think that's what we will continue to see, where you have high design or high value designs that might also be for non-famous mark, people who license their designs, for example, and so that might become a problem for them. Same with copyright. We discuss here trademarks, but these patterns, they're also copyright, they're works of art. So the next question is, are these derivative works or are they transformative work under a fair use or fair dealing exception? And so this is where these overlaps become so interesting as well. Please.
Do you hear me? Actually,
You can just speak loud. I mean, it's fine.
okay, it's better. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'm Jorge Gomez, professor of IP at Mount University. This is a subject actually I'm taking a great interest in, and I've been following your and Professor Mezzi's work on this subject matter. What I would like to ask is whether asserting the sustainability as a policy argument into exhaustion principle as is requires another legal basis because the moment we do that, we are essentially encroaching on the property right on the constitutional level, which is a holy thing, which is a sacred thing, and it can only be amended or recessed by substantive laws. But as the exhaustion principle, we are having a general clause uh, like allowing their further commercialization in essential terms. However, in this scenario, just asserting in an interpretive way that the policy arguments would, I think, a little endanger the constitutionally sacred right of property. What are your views on that?
Well, I think you are hitting a very important point, but I want to turn it around. I think there are multiple fundamental rights here. There is the fundamental right of intellectual property. mm. Intellectual property, even in some countries, is seen as a right to property. But then there is the right to property of the buyers and the owner of that item. So Joseph Kohler, when he developed the theory behind the principle of IP exhaustion in the civil law, that was really this clash, this property of IP versus property of physical goods. And both are fundamental rights. Okay. And so then it's my right to use my property as I want. And then there is the fundamental rights to freedom of business and freedom of competition. I am much more perhaps skeptical of the fundamental right. Eleni Zumienko has also written about that, but she's also, coming out of this fundamental right to a healthy environment. I believe that we all have a fundamental right to an healthy environment, but the connection between upcycling and an healthy environment, it's not so obvious because sometimes upcycling mixes pieces of extra plastic, and so it's not as green as the upcycler wants to say. In fact, the courts in Singapore clearly elaborated on that, say, sustainability here is not sustainable. You are actually mixing more plastic. The court in France, there is a case about Hermes scarf, also elaborated on, well, putting Hermes scarves on cheap t-shirt doesn't help the environment. You're actually adding on, um, unsustainable material are creating even more waste. But the fundamental rights to these two set of property. So I agree with you. I think we should look for what's already there in the exhaustion rules. And even though there is a material difference problem, there is also in Europe, certainly under some of the old cases of the Court of Justice, if we take away selective distribution, we have Bristol Squibb Paranova, we have Ballantines, where products that were modified by importers were still found to be okay to move around Europe based on the supremacy of free movement of goods versus enforcement of IP rights. The question is, this is where disclaimer, if we can dispel confusion, say, I am the upcycler, I take Louis Vuitton pieces, but I add green, okay, with a heart. So that's now it's the bag upcycled by Irene. So there is no confusion. It's my brand and the actual rich, modified products. And so that can be an artistic and something that there is no confusion. The quality is changed, but at the same time, the free movement of goods should prevail and the my property versus the IP owner, if there is a harm or not. So it becomes a matter of facts in that case. But I believe we already have. And the other way to look at it is through transformation. Is that a fair use? Or it's that a transformed product that could go under freedom of expression? Mm. So it's my way to express my creativity in this way that takes pieces of well-known products and I transform them in something else. So I believe there are defenses. I've written about that with my student as well, my student Gabrielle Armstrong. And we developed every theory we could to try to say there should be a space here. But there is a clash of fundamental rights, for sure. It's like, patent, right to property, right to public health. So which one prevails when? And, it's not that clear. Thank you. She has a question. I don't know how would you want to.
Hello, my name is Dr. Turjana Yusufazı from Kazakhstan. First of all, thank you for your exceptional research on the recycling scene. So my question is how we can convince people who doesn't feel gratified to use second-hand commodities. Thank you.
Well, I think that when you have Kendall Jenner saying this vintage Gucci and go, sorry, I know about this thing because my daughter shows those to me. If you have celebrity embracing thrifting, and if you look the many of the famous fashion show do that. I can tell you, I mostly buy used things because it's cool, because it's cheaper, and because you have so many great offers, and you have a bit of a unique piece versus everything. So I think, first of all, it's a budgetary thing. I mean, you can buy two for 3 or 4 for the price of one, and it's all about say the younger generation, my daughter generations, they like it. I love it. I way more prefer to buy a used cool thing, thinking I made a good deal out of something than not. But say celebrity endorsement, and I would say many are now doing that. And sorry for the gentlemen, but my son is a very fashionable, young man. He bought, his Armani suit, his Armani coat, everything at the Mercatino in Via Zuretti because mom would not open the wallet for the real Armani in the shop, and so he buys everything. Um, we tend to buy a lot of things because there's great quality. It's still there is so much. The other thing is if a product is done with good quality, costs more, but then has more resale value and has more life in it. And so I think the big problem in our society is we have too much stuff. But we need the economy. So if something costs more and people get more money up front, and then there is more jobs in the middle, you still have a very flourishing economy without having too much items that it's really what the problem is about. It's we have too much production, so too much energy, and then we have too much waste that often we don't know what to do with. And the other thing is obviously there is a regulatory part here. I think partially it's the competitive system of IP, but the real way to resolve part of that is a regulatory system. So the government should say, company, you are a fashion company, you will get a big tax rebate if you produce with recycled materials, or you have to produce 30% with recycled materials, otherwise you get a fine, and you get a tax rebate if you do more than that. So you see, is that think about the car emission in the past were way more polluting, and then the government has entered through tax rebate and mandatory rules, standard and mandatory rules. So obviously company resist that because it's more cost, and their costs that either they're transferred to consumers or to their profit, and nobody wants change. But now many young way to think, it's you need to do, if you do your own customization. I mean, think about big luxury goods. You can't buy a Cartier watch every year. I mean, unless you are very wealthy, you buy one for a big occasion. Okay. But now they are selling the new bracelets. They are accessorizing the bracelet, or they sell the bags and you can buy the charms, meaning that you can buy a new piece, an accessory every year. So there is a big market there. Mm. And so I think that's our company are also doing their own vintage. But the most important thing is I hope you all buy used when you can, because it's cool. It's not just good. It's actually very cool. And then you say it's vintage and it's cool.
That's a good point.
I think we have to close. Yusuf. with his beautiful suit.
Thank you.
Your suit, by the way, I want to really thank him and Omer as well, because they've been our guardian angels and they've been so incredible. So really, thank you. Teşekkür ederim. And
So we would like to thank our Professor Halboli for our presentation and sharings. Hocamıza sunumları ve paylaşımları için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Şimdi oturumumuz kapandıktan sonra 15 dakika aramız olacaktır. Kahve molası olacaktır. Now there's going to be a 15 minutes coffee break. Thank you.
thank you.
Efendim? Okay, there's going to be a 10 minutes coffee break right now. That's we change. Thank you. It's a
Yeah.
There is a